Thank you, Deputy Speaker. My mother was a World War II widow. Her husband, Jack Leonard, was killed in Papua New Guinea in 1943. My sisters never knew their father. My family has lived with this sacrifice and loss all our lives. Jack was one of the over 103,000 Australians who've made that ultimate sacrifice, those who have lost their lives when Australia has supported our allies in times of conflict, aggression and attempted oppression. Our servicemen and women also fought and died so that Australians can be free, tolerant and live in peace in one of the world's greatest democracies, one that believes in the rule of law, in which we have the right to religious freedom. The deeds of those men and women help define who we are as a nation, and it is a nation worth defending. Equally, we have to continue to defend our values and way of life, to continue to be worthy of the sacrifice made by those who have given their lives and their families. However, I believe that every one of those 103,000 who fought and died in conflict would be as ashamed as I am and disgusted, not only with the divisive growth in anti-Semitism in Australia, but also the Prime Minister and Labor government's weakness and lack of leadership in dealing with this crisis that has allowed anti-Semitism to fester and grow in our communities. The Prime Minister has totally failed to provide the moral and political leadership against those who are actively inciting hatred and violence in Australia. How appalling is it that Jewish people living in Australia have never felt and never been as vulnerable, targeted and intimidated as they are right now? The hate preachers who've been allowed to get away with openly inciting anti-Semitism, the Jew die graffiti on a school, the repeated use of anti-Semitic chants from the river to the sea and intifada, deeply anti-Semitic terms not called out by the Prime Minister. Peter Dutton is right when he said anti-Semitism is not just a threat to one segment of our community. It's a threat to Australia's social cohesion and our democratic values. And it is appalling that some of the worst anti-Semitic and hateful intimidation activists are coming from our university campuses, with the tacit support of weak university leaders, or worse, Sydney University's Mark Scott openly rewarding anti-Semitic hate and vilification. Peter Cosgrove got it right recently when he said Hitler would be proud. After all, that's how bad anti-Semitism is in Australia. Anybody in any doubt? You need to take a walk in a Jewish person's shoes. How much longer will Jewish students have to fear for their safety at universities? Again, we've seen nothing but weakness from the Prime Minister on this. The coalition government will actually cancel the visas of any student protesters involved in spreading anti-Semitism or supporting terrorism. We will not tolerate racism, anti-Semitism or public support for Hamas or terrorist organisations. I am deeply and profoundly ashamed that the Labor government chose by default to reward the designated terrorist group Hamas for its barbarous attacks on October 7 by voting for a resolution at the UN granting a unique form of UN membership to the State of Palestine. I was equally ashamed when the New South Wales Police simply watched the anti-Semitic protests at the Opera House. However, it pales on the back of this UN pro-Hamas anti-Israel decision by the government. It's a decision that ignores the wisdom of Bob Hawke, who said, if the bell tolls for Israel, it tolls for all mankind. Labor has totally trashed Australia's historic bipartisan support for Israel, the only liberal democratic country in the Middle East. And Labor's UN decision does not facilitate a two-state solution. And as I said, it is a morally bankrupt decision, further compounding the grief and vulnerability of Jewish Australians, those the Prime Minister has let down. It's a decision that has by default rewarded Hamas for those appalling atrocities and the barbarity committed on October 7, the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. The utterly barbaric rape, the mutilation, torture and murder of 1,200, mostly civilian women, men, children and babies. The kidnapping of 250 hostages, 130 who are still in captivity or dead. Now, Hamas has made it very clear. It has said it will continue these attacks to annihilate the Jews and repeat those same October 7 attacks. There is absolutely no equivalence between Israel, which is a democratic country, and Hamas, a designated terrorist organisation. And Israel does have the right to defend itself. But Labor's decision to, by default, support Hamas through the UN vote has undoubtedly severely increased the vulnerability and fears of Jewish Australians. The decision rewards and incites terrorist activity and rewards bullies. I've got no doubt it emboldened campus and other activists. It also completely betrayed our traditional allies, the US and the UK, relationships that are going to become even more important in the years ahead. Make no mistake, the Labor government voted against Israel, but voted with Russia, China and Iran. That's a shameful and disgraceful decision, and one that ignores our history for fighting for democracy, fighting for Australian values and what is right. It sends a dreadful message that the Labor government stands with those who use violence and intimidation to achieve their goals, certainly not in Australia's national interest or what Australians have fought and died for. Australia's Prime Minister compounded this weakness by refusing to comment on the ICC proposal. Weak and again totally out of step with our allies. The US unequivocally rejected the ICC's application, reinforcing the strong message that there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. Now, I originally thought that the Prime Minister's weakness exposed him as a commentator and not a decision-maker, but on the back of lack of response to the ICC, not only not a decision-maker, not a commentator, a spectator, and one who has set Australia on a divisive and destructive path, not only with Hamas and anti-Semitism, but also in total failure to stand up for Australia and our defence forces with China. Weakness, yet again. In June, as we saw, not in June, where he's given in to China's pressure. And if you do that, they will simply take another step forward. That handsome boy comment was not a compliment. It showed contempt and a lack of respect for a weak Prime Minister. A Prime Minister who failed to stand up for our Royal Australian Navy HMAS Toowoomba and its divers over the deliberate sonar attacks. He failed to raise this directly with Xi Jinping when he had the opportunity. A Prime Minister who continues to demonstrate weakness with China, with not enough courage to directly raise the tough issues. That's what a Prime Minister should be doing on behalf of this nation. But this weak response further emboldened China to show its contempt for Australia, taking another step forward by the dangerous and provocative intimidation by the PLA's jet firing flares at a Royal Australian Navy Seahawk. It had put the lives of our RAF members at direct risk. They could have been killed. So when will Australia's Prime Minister actually stand up for our ADF and all Australians? No Labor minister at all, I understand, has actually spoken directly to their Chinese counterpart about this incident. So, Prime Minister, I've got a question. Would you have supported that UN vote that has by default rewarded Hamas? If the 1,200 women, children, men, babies who were barbarically and brutally tortured and murdered on October 7, the 250 kidnapped by Hamas, the 130 still held hostage or dead, if these people were actually Australians, because they're people no different to us, and we normally stand up for those in these circumstances, or would you still be that cowardly commentator and a weak spectator rewarding a registered terrorist organisation responsible for the atrocities with a UN vote? If it were Australians on October 7, how would your government have responded to other countries telling Australia to show restraint in its response? And I can tell you exactly what Australians would be demanding of us if the victims and hostages were Australians attacked on Australian soil. Prime Minister, historically and as we see currently, there are nationally, globally critical decisions that need to be made by the government of the day. They are decisions that are far more important and far outweigh the politics of the day or an upcoming election, where Australia needs strong, capable leadership that makes decisions in the national interest, in Australia's interests as well as in the interests of our allies. Prime Minister, it is your duty to act in Australia's national interest, to have the courage and conviction to stand up against political interests and pressures from within your own party and put the national interest first. It is the job of a true statesman. That is the tough job of a Prime Minister. On this count, Prime Minister, you failed this nation, and your decision to support by default Hamas, China, Iran and Russia at the UN, and by failing to be strong in controlling the rampant rise of aggressive and escalating anti-Semitism in Australia, egregious and unforgivable failure. Talking about the problem does not fix the problem. And let's not forget that Australia and Israel are historic allies. Remember the extraordinary efforts of our Australian light horsemen at the Battle of Beersheba. Never forget that the legacy of the Battle of Beersheba by the Australian Light Horse Brigade was an Australian-led victory that helped in part to return Israel to the Jewish people. In World War II, I know what my mother's husband, Jack Leonard, and his World War II mates, who fought and died for Australia, would say about Labor's vote at the UN and the appalling failure to act on anti-Semitism. I know exactly what my mother would be thinking and feeling if she were alive. I know personally what my one living sister thinks right now. This is not the Australia my father died for. What we have now is definitely not the Australia these men and women gave their lives for. I had the honour of presenting or laying a wreath at Tyne Cot on behalf of our servicemen and women. I also saw the cemetery at Polygon Wood, and I met the oldest Menengate bugler. And I said to him, I thanked him most profoundly for the fact that they have played our last post over 30,000 times. They're all volunteers, and I looked at those 55,000 names on that bridge, and I said to him, I thanked him for playing our last post and for all his people. And he said, you listen to me. He was one of the oldest ones surviving. He said, at the time, it was like genocide when the Germans were rolling across this country. He said, what we know here is that all we are and all we have is because of your Australians' blood on our soil. That freedom and that right is what Australians should be continuing to fight for. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member.